In this episode, I visit with Anselmo Guevara
Hello,
from
this is Tom
VMware.
Fox, back for another episode. And today I'm thrilled to have with me Anselmo Guevara. And Anselmo, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Oh, thank you, Tom.
Anselmo, could you tell us a little bit about your professional background?
Sure. I actually started with Ernst & Young back in 1998. I had the opportunity to use one of the first serial port license keys of ACL, the analytical software at the time, and it was the only one. Then I went to work in an internal audit department for the next 6 years, and I was lucky because they had also five license keys of ACL. And so I was able to use the software in that internal audit department. I worked in internal audit, always using data analytics as part of my job for about 12 years. And then I switched and went to work into a compliance department, which is my current employer. And I still continue to use some type of data analytics software. I'm an avid user of Tableau. We have a corporate license. And so now I have become more skillful using dashboarding and storytelling. And so analytics, if you're in an internal auditor, you're always going to end up using some type of software, Excel. So it's always been in my career as a skill in my toolbox.
So could you tell us your current role?
Yes. I manage the investigation function with my current employer at VMware for 8 years. And I developed the skills to understand the schemes that were part of our investigations, and that made me a candidate to be the person for a compliance monitoring role. And so my department created this specific role for me because I had all the background, I knew all the schemes, and if you add data analytics on top of that, you have like the perfect situation where you have someone who can understand how it happens and how to find it. And so I've been on this new job for the last two years. And I was the first one to start this type of job and also start creating the compliance monitoring function for the company, or the legal and ethics and compliance department more specifically.
You've talked about your role and how you have used data analytics, but I'm always intrigued by what was the support of those above you for using data analytics, whether it was senior management, whether it was the chief compliance officer, whether it was the head of internal audit. How did you find support literally from those you report to for using this tool at VMware?
Sure. It happens that my now former manager, I have a new manager, was an attendee of the annual FCPA conference every year in November, December. And I also got to go for the first time last November to Washington, D.C. and attend that 2-3 day conference. And for the first time, I heard it directly from regulators. If you have data, you have to be looking at it. It's not like you get data and then someone approves, reviews, reconciles, and then you're done. No, that's the operations team. You in compliance and ethics and compliance, you have to be looking at it for trends, anomalies, etc., from a compliance point of view. And I was lucky enough that my manager was a regular attendee for several years. And so she was the one trying to drive the implementation of the compliance monitoring. from a department perspective. And her support was very big in implementing this function. Where we had a little bit of convincing or persuading was outside the legal department, because then we had to go to IT, and they get many proposals from everybody, any business unit. And so now you are talking about competing priorities, who gets number 10 on the list of projects, number 5, etc. And so then it becomes a question of do we implement internally, or do we look for a vendor who already has a solution? So it becomes this type of decision making. But in my department, the support was great. And we just had to network outside the legal department with IT, with the CFO organization, and make our case. And eventually we got budget and we started implementing something.
So let me turn to the use of data analytics, and whether it's how you either advocate they be used or how you're using them. How should an organization get started with a compliance monitoring journey?
I attend many webinars. I go to conferences, and they tell you to start with the low-hanging fruit. And I'm gonna break the pattern here, because I'm not a big fan of low-hanging fruit. It can lead to you being challenged when you use something to make a business case, get budget for your project, and you may not be presenting the best case to your budget approvers. What I suggest, and what we did internally, was to do a formal compliance risk assessment, where we looked at our compliance risk across the company. And then we started diving into what is the compliance control that we want to see in this process, in this operation. And then we started identifying just the compliance controls that we want to have in place, documented. Later, we started looking at, does the data exist? And what does it take to get the data, bring it on board from anywhere? And so you worry about those things later, but a formal risk assessment where you work with accounts payable, receivables, internal audit, business operations, various teams that have the data you may want and own the process. Those are the ones you need to work and collaborate to understand where are the risks in the process, and tied to the compliance risks or regulatory risks that we want to prevent from happening. And so we created what we call internally a controls inventory list. And so then we started designing specific tests, and then determining, do we have data, and then create the test and analytics. And if the data didn't exist, started thinking, what does it take to bring data or make it available for our analysis? And in some cases, many of your members in your audience are going to have the challenge that data doesn't exist, it's troublesome to bring it over just for 1 or 2 specific tests. And so you have a dilemma where do we worry about this or leave it for later? And so you have to move on. But a formal risk assessment where you work with other people who have the knowledge of the risks, the process in your organization, is going to be extremely helpful.
You have been either directly or tangentially working in the data analytics field, I now found out, since the 90s because of your early work.
Yes.
And your journey is a bit unusual, I would say, simply because not that many people started that long ago. But what would you say to the current college student, law student, or MBA student about having a career, data-driven career in compliance? How would you suggest they get started today?
So I understand that many schools today have some kind of curriculum that may include a class related to data analytics, whether it's a business or legal career. I'm not talking about data science. Obviously, they're going to have more than what you and I would typically learn in a school program. But I think we are in the age where today there are so many free resources available out there. I was mentioning that I'm a Tableau user. You don't need a license for Tableau. They have webinars, they have a community that you can join for free and ask questions or read whatever someone else asked before. They have publications, blogs, and other similar software like Click or any other have so many resources available for the public. And if you have a school project, you can make use of those free resources. There is also YouTube. There are times when I load a file and then I get inconsistent data type issues and messages, and I have to search like, why am I getting this message? And you can find resources on YouTube also that tell you here is the reason you're getting this type of a message and how to avoid it, how to fix it. So today, there are so many free resources out there for you to become a data-driven compliance professional, or just get through school and be able to finish your project or learn something more in depth if that's what you're after.
After your remarks on low-hanging fruit and your distaste for them, I'm almost reluctant to ask this question, but are there some data sets you would suggest a compliance professional or a fraud risk professional start with for a data analytics or overall monitoring program?
Yeah, so if you are in a compliance role, whether you're a lawyer or a compliance officer, and depending on your industry, your organization, most organizations selling something will likely be giving discounts in order to make a sale, because that's the incentive. They want to give a discount in order to get the PO and bring in the revenue. So my suggestion is look at discounts. The other top two that I have is payments, obviously, and travel and entertainment. All you have to do is look at the enforcement actions, DOJ/SEC or either or, and you'll be able to tell what happened to Oracle, what happened to Microsoft, and you'll be able to tell that discounts, entertainment, payments are always the theme in any of those enforcement actions. Many people ask, how did it happen? You're not going to learn how it happened. You're going to learn maybe the overall broad scheme, how the enforcement agency documented the scheme. But it's up to you to be creative and look at your own organization and process, and be able to tell, here is how it could happen. We need to design a test to be able to detect and prevent this, so it doesn't happen like to Microsoft or SAP or any other in those enforcement actions.
I've often heard fraud risk investigators or certified fraud risk examiners say you have to think like a fraudster.
Yes.
Was that a fair statement?
It is, because when I was in the internal audit department for a couple of companies, we conducted the fraud risk assessment that was part of the SOX compliance program. And then you start developing those fraud scenarios as if you were the fraudster. So you have to think like, okay, so here is the process. Here is how we approve a transaction. what can go wrong, or how can I bypass the process in order to do something that I'm not allowed by policy or by guidelines, and be able to game the system. So you need to think like a fraudster.
All right, you've identified for us the parameters. I've now found a suspicious transaction. I can't say I found fraud, but it's suspicious. What do I do now? Do I write it up and send it to legal, to the investigations department? Do I personally handle it? I found a suspicious transaction. What do I do now?
And suspicious is the right word, because you can have the best software out there today in the market, and all the software does is be configured to tell you, here is what you told me to highlight for you. But now you as the user have to do something with that suspicious transaction. And my suggestion is you need to do a lot of validation before you actually communicate that to anyone internally, your own department or outside the department, like finance or accounts payable, etc. The issue here is that your credibility may be at stake if you don't come up with something that is actually an issue. So you have to validate. I had a case where there was this one-time vendor. We never had business with them. We made a big sponsorship payment of $25,000. And then I was curious, like, why are we making this sponsorship payment to this vendor? And so I ran searches on the internet. I don't see any announcements or past announcements on Twitter, on blogs, on the internet in general. And so I'm wondering, okay, one-time payment, never done business with this vendor, and I don't see anything in social media or the internet about the conference that supposedly we were sponsoring. And so if I had gone to my accounts payable team and told them, hey, we got an issue here because the software alerted me that this is a suspicious transaction, my credibility is at stake. So you have to do a lot of validation, due diligence before you actually tell anyone you have to, we have an issue here. It may not be an issue. It may be that there are no records on the internet for a specific purpose, but that's for you to find out why later. But you need to do a lot of validation with any software you're using, even if it's in-house or a vendor that is providing the software to you.
Where do you see the use of data analytics in internal audit, in fraud risk management, or even compliance down the road in 2030 or beyond?
We're going to continue using data analytics software. I think we are hoping for more maturity in predictive analytics. Right now, we are not quite there. The problem with, not problem, but predictive analytics requires that you have certain criteria, and then you're going to use that criteria to develop your predictive capabilities. That requires a lot of internal work within an organization. It is not something that a software vendor can do for you, because they are going to tell you, here's the software, but you need to tell us what is the criteria that is going to predict certain transaction. And not all transactions may be susceptible to predictive analytics. There is only certain type of transactions that can be predictive. And so, but I'm hoping that in the future, that type of capability is going to become more mature. In artificial intelligence, there is a lot of talk these days. We're not quite there yet. By 2030, we may be using it in a more um, safe place. I think in public companies, there is a lot of questions about using the latest buzzword, ChatGPT, because you have to rely, basically, it requires putting your data out there for the analysis, and not many companies are willing to do that. If you're using free resources available on the internet to do something with that type of capability, it is okay, but you may get garbage in, garbage out. But there may be some use for this type of artificial intelligence in the next 8-7 years. But today we're not quite there. It's going to take some level of and time for that to mature.
And Selma, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted any more information on yourself or any of the topics we've touched on, what might be the best place for them to go?
LinkedIn, I'm available there, and they can send me a message or send me a request.
Well, I wanted to thank you again for taking some time to visit with me, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Sure, and thank you, Tom.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Data Driven Compliance. Data Driven Compliance is now the award-winning Data Driven Compliance, having won a Communicators Award for a top podcast in business. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I hope you'll subscribe, rate, and review wherever great podcasts are listened to. Data Driven Compliance is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.